hitting that cow.
Yeah.
Dude, I was setting this stuff up and just sat down and just punched the front of my knee right where the incision is, right into the leg of the table. So that was
Oh,
nice.
yeah.
But I mean, it's whatever. It's like a little ding. It's not that big of a deal, but it was like the first time that I've really banged it on something. So that was,
Yeah, that's a vulnerable spot too. That's easy to bang. Like I was fortunate, mine was on the inside of my arm, so it's
yeah.
always protected. But I'm sure it's not going to be the last time.
No. Then that's the thing about going hunting too. It's like I'm getting to that point where I'm close. I think for the first time in my life, I wish I lived in some flat ground where I could just, go
Yeah,
walk a logging road or something. But I don't know. I called Grant, so he didn't answer. I'm gonna see what he's doing this weekend, and maybe we can, at the very least, like, try to call onto the road or something.
yeah, that'd be cool. I didn't think about it either, like the fact that you spend a lot of time on your knees, especially with deer hunting from the ground. That's probably gonna aggravate it a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
at least in turkey hunting, you're sitting on your butt as behind the gun. When you're
Mm-hmm.
filming though, that's you're gonna be on your knees a lot, and that's probably gonna hurt it a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, it's gonna be an experimental deal
Yeah,
once I start going, because I feel like there's things that I don't even know about yet that are gonna be hang-ups. And
yeah.
the other thing is like going downhill, like when it bends, it puts so much pressure on the front of the knee,
Mm.
which is where they took the graft from, is the patellar tendon. So it's like any aggressive terrain where you would, take a step and drop multiple feet, I'm out on it, which which is weird because, typically I love that stuff. So
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to like think trail,
yeah,
walking the bottom only, no up and around him, just like hopefully you can bring him down. So
uh-huh.
I don't know. It also makes me like appreciate trying to find places that are easy to access and trying to like think back on, what those places look like when I have found them in the past. And I have been spending a bunch of time map scouting with a little bit of a different perspective on it. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. That'll come into play in the topic we're discussing today as far as finding places to access while driving around. That'll be a new thing that you haven't really thought about before. It's been the opposite mindset for you.
I was back visiting Ben, and I usually walk around scouting a bunch, and I was like, man, like, you know, this kind of sucks because I can't walk and cover a bunch of ground like I want. I'm going to just be limited to checking stuff out in the car. And I still think that's beneficial, but then it's kind of was a light bulb moment like, hey, this would be a pretty cool opportunity to talk about this in the podcast. So,
Mm-hmm.
specifically today, Hayden and I are going to be talking about driving around to scout. And this can be in season, out of season. Um, there's times where this has directly helped us find critters to chase. Sometimes that day, sometimes the next day. But you'll hear us talk about when we first get to a new location, we usually spend at least a day driving around, checking out new areas, and kind of creating a list of places that maybe when we got there, we had 10 places that we had map scouted that it's like, okay, this is worth checking out. But generally speaking, by the time we make that initial loop or spend that first day or two cruising around an area, that list goes down. But sometimes there's places too that, we didn't notice on the map, but once you drive around, you pick up on something. So
Yeah.
I feel like we've been pretty vague about that in the past, but we want to hopefully talk about some specific examples in this and, you know, share with you guys some of the things that we're looking for specifically. First thing, like when driving around, what would you say is like kind of the initial thing that you're looking for?
There's a couple different scenarios that I break it down into. One's like you said, you're going to a different state. It's during the season, and you're trying to hunt now. Another time frame is like out of season. You're trying to scout for the future. And then a third scenario would be like on opening days. Sometimes I'll skip the morning hunt, especially if it's like a gun season where pressure's super high, and I'll just drive around that opening morning just to figure out where everyone is from a
Mm-hmm.
pressure standpoint. But I guess if if we start with the like, you're in a new place and you plan on hunting that day, the first thing that I'm doing is looking for access and trying to identify like levels of pressure on specific accesses.
You can always see on the map the obvious access points, the roads. A lot of times, even like on OnX, you'll see parking area. Like now there's an icon on there that just straight up says parking area. Some states on public land make you park in specific areas or
Mhm.
some, pieces of public. So kind of getting an idea of what those look like, I would say, is really the starting point. And I value it so much because when you go to it, there's so many things that can happen along the way. But initially, I would say sign of hunting pressure.
Yeah.
Obviously, if people are pulled in there, that's gonna change our opinion on an area. But let's say you pull up to a spot and you've got this whole road access where there's public on both sides of the road. I would say a lot of times what I'm looking for within those pull offs is direct hunter sign. Like how used and abused is this spot? So a lot of times, pull up, look and see, are there tire tracks in there? Are there fresh tire tracks in there? Is it something that you can tell maybe there's junk laying in there? Like people consistently are pulling in there and dropping stuff out of their truck or straight up just leaving it on the ground, which by no means am promoting that. I actually hate that, so don't do that. But that definitely can tell you if people are, again, using and abusing a spot. There's the type of pull off that's like a little spot for a vehicle in the dirt off the road or off a dirt road. But then there's this type of spot that, has a little culvert over the ditch. And then there's a big parking area that's gravel. You
Yep.
can tell people pull in there all the time. Those I generally,
They're not your first option. That was kind of one thing I was going to talk about, is like identifying those parking spots. Like you said, you can identify uh, those man-made parking spots pretty easily on the map, but I try to identify like something that's more obscure of an access point, and then figure out, is the shoulder wide enough where you can park on it? Are you allowed to access from those locations in that state or wildlife management area? And just trying to identify those obscure places that you can go in.
mm-hmm. There'll also be areas, especially in that situation where you have public on both sides, where there'll just be a whole bunch of pull offs. And if they
Mm-hmm.
all kind of look the same, like let's say if there was only in a mile stretch of road, there was only one pull off and it looked, people are in there, but nothing crazy. But then in that same mile or, that same distance, if there was 8 of them and they were all used about the same as that one would be, I view that differently too. Like there's a whole bunch of options to pull in here. I generally think, this is definitely getting a lot of attention. And I think that one way to look at it is if there's like an obvious road into a piece of public land, like a lot of times smack in the middle, those are the types of places that get a lot of attention. Because just like we are sometimes drawn to them, everybody sees that and they think, well, I can go in there and I'm not even close to private. I got public all over. I can go for miles and not run into any private land. But sometimes that funnels people too. I'm not saying it's not worth looking at, but sometimes that funnels people, especially if that, main access road right through the middle is a paved road or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
big parking areas and stuff like that. And then the other thing that I would say that I look for within some of those pull offs would be like, are people driving past a gate? Are they taking four wheelers around it? If you get out and walk down a trail, are there just boot tracks in those first few puddles, off the road that are just worn way into the ground? You may view that as too much pressure as well. And every spot's going to be different, and every county, state, piece of public land is going to have varying levels of pressure. But is there anything else that you look for as far as pull offs?
I guess like if there's a sign of a recent harvest in there, like for turkeys, like if there's feathers on the ground, or like if some people just got their deer right in a parking lot, just looking to see if someone harvested an animal in that specific area, which can be a positive indicator that is game to chase in there, but also there's one less game to be chased in there. So
Mm-hmm.
an extra little piece of information that you can gain from it. But yeah, the main thing is just like amount of tires, trash, like you mentioned, and it can be it can be especially useful if it just rained in the last few days because you can tell how recent people are there, and that's for scouting across the board. Like scouting after rain is usually the best time to do it, but from that same standpoint of just identifying pressure, I think like after a rain, if you have time to drive around and see like a couple days after a rain, you can have a better idea of exactly how many people have been in there in a shorter time frame.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that I forgot to mention would be, are people coming from private? So
Yeah.
as you're looking for that hunter sign, keeping an eye on what you can see from the private as well. Like, for example, I'm taking note if there's a little hunting cabin or hunting camp that butts up to, one edge of public land, especially if you can tell, like, they got archery targets back there, or, they got the sign that says so and so hunt camp. Like, that was something we noticed a ton in Pennsylvania, was hunt camp signs, which is cool, but it's also like giving away that that's where you're going in from. So that can be used to your advantage as well. Another thing would be looking for stands or like tower stands on the edge of public, I would say.
Mhm.
That's not to say that it would deter me from hunting there, but if I was maybe thinking about intercepting deer coming from public bedding to an open area on private, and I can tell people are hunting that edge just from looking at the road, see a tower blind or something, then maybe I know that, okay, I'm going to push deeper in there to try to get closer to that bedding versus, playing it a little safer, closer to the property boundary, assuming the boundary is right on, that field edge or something. So that's something else that I notice. And again, not to say that that's going to deter us completely, but it is a factor.
Yeah. On the flip side of that too, like in the past, I've found like signs that say wildlife sanctuary that butts up right next to public, or like anything that identifies that there's no hunting on a property that butts up next to public. Like that's a good thing to find.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just being aware of your surroundings at all times. And I think even the way that you drive, I think is important. Like, I've gotten on my dad a few times when he's the one that's driving that day. I'm like, dude, where are you going? Like, just tone it back, slow down. We got nowhere where we're going. Let's just keep our eyes peeled, slow roll through places, find a speed that works for you to where you can, if you're in the passenger seat, you can keep your eyes moving, look for animals, look at some of these details that we're talking about. But then if you're driving, obviously, you tone it back even more, stay safe. There's no
Yeah.
rush when you're doing this, especially if you have a route planned. And I think having a route planned is important. Like, this isn't just aimlessly driving around. There's generally checkpoints that, we want to look at, and there's various factors that jump out at us a lot of times. A lot of them really come down to habitat, which we'll talk about that in a minute.
One other point too, like aside from identifying parking lots, is identifying roads that you can drive, because a lot of times you'll see on the map that it'll look like there's a road there and there's not actually a road, or there's a road that there's a gate at. Finding where those gates are and just trying to identify where you can actually drive is one other thing aside from parking lots that I look for.
That's actually a really big factor that can change your whole outlook on a place
Mm-hmm.
very quickly. Is like, oh, there's this whole road system through here, but then you get to that point from, a more main road, and all of a sudden you're like, there's a gate here. Like, all these roads are just, being used by the state or whatever to manage the land, and they drive back there, but there's a gate to where you can't drive back there. And I find that being one of the most valuable things is
Yeah. Yeah, because you're map scouting and you see a road that runs through the whole thing, and you're like, oh well, all these places close to that road, kind of just not even going to think about them, and then you find out it's not actually a road that people can travel on. It opens up a lot of doors, so that's definitely a big one to look for. It's one of the between that and park and like finding access areas are like the two main things of just trying to under, understand a bigger picture of that landscape that you can't quite get just from map scouting.
Hmm. I also like to look at where those access points are in relation to the terrain. So, like, for example, if I find a pull off in the bottom in super steep hilly country, I almost always just assume that there's probably up to 50% less people ever accessing from that
Yeah.
point. Where, on the other hand, you drive up the hill or mountain and you get to the top, and there's an access point right on the ridge to where you can walk for miles and never leave the top, never have to go down and then back up. And I view that very differently. It's not to
Mm-hmm.
say that it's not worth hunting in those areas, but you can adjust based off of where that pressure's coming from a little bit. As far as like a particular pull off or spot, it's like, how thick is it from the road, or is there like water
Yeah,
crossing?
that's a big thing, especially a lot of the terrain I hunt in Wisconsin is like,
Hmm.
how high is the river? Is that river bottom going to be completely flooded out where I can't even hunt it at all? Or like you're saying, is there some river that or creek that's restricting access through this certain area? Like water levels is another really big one that I'm looking for, and I'll check that at all times of season because that's going to change frequently throughout the season. So
There's a lot of places like that too that you may not even be able to notice water from the map, for example. So,
mm-hmm.
one example that I have from pretty recently was I was driving around this block and it really was no interest to me at all. But as I drove around it, it kind of dawned on me. It's like, okay, there's a beaver dam here that you cannot tell is as wet as it is from the map. Like you look at it on the map and it just kind of looks like a grassy bottom with maybe a little bit of water trickling through it, but nothing you would even worry about. But there had been a backup of water because there was a beaver in there, had completely flooded out the bottom. And then I drove around the other side, and the way that the road was, there was public only on one side, and everything coming down to the road was so steep that there was no room to pull off. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was just one of those deals where the hills were really tight to the road. There was just no option to park there. I guess otherwise you'd have to trudge through Beaver Dam, which I don't know, if you have waders or something you could do it, but you're also going to make a bunch of noise doing that. The more that I look for it, the more that I notice there's so many access points. They appear to be access points because the road butts to it, but when you actually drive through that area, the hill comes right down to the road. And if
Mm-hmm.
that's the case, there's literally not room to park a vehicle there. But generally, you could, park up the road and walk down the road, or park down the road and walk up a ridge and get to where you're hunting right above the road. But those are the types of places that really stick out to me when we use the term overlooked. It's like people are just driving right past that every day because there's no option to park there. But if there is
Mm-hmm.
a big obvious pull off, we're all drawn to that as hunters. It's like, oh, we can go in right here.
Yeah.
One other thing would just be how thick is it off the road? So, similar to that hill example that I just used, where the terrain just butts right up to the road, giving you no room to park. There's a lot of situations that I've seen, like down south especially, where there's so much thick vegetation right by the road that it'd be a little weird to go in right there. But that may allow you to find a spot where there's a bunch of deer right off the road just
Yeah.
because, it's a bear to get through it.
Yeah, and with like finding places that are close to access that there may be deer in, I think like especially in hilly terrain where like where's a spot by this pull off that a deer could observe people coming in and out of? Like, is there a high point that overlooks this parking lot where they can just monitor people coming in and out? Like, that's one thing I try to look for too. Is like where would a deer feel comfortable monitoring access from and like trying to find places that might be of interest that are close to the road. That's another factor as well. And then again on the water topic, we talked about like where water's restricting access, but also where like, is this creek wide enough to get a kayak down? Is it moving too fast, like you mentioned, where it wouldn't be safe to try to get a kayak down? Is it big enough where someone could get a boat in and go way back down in there? Like trying to look at water as a form of added access as
Hmm.
well as restricted access.
It's so common now to hunt with a boat or a kayak or canoe that honestly I view it almost as something that I only want to do if it's really obvious nobody else is doing it, because there's so many examples nowadays where I'm going past a creek and you can tell somebody's drug something to just cross the creek, uh, or they're accessing and floating down and going in that way. There's a lot of public land that has water around it, and
Mhm.
in those situations, there's a lot of people that are accessing through those water sources. Again, it's not to say that we won't do it or it doesn't work, because you're going to see us do it again, but it just takes a little bit deeper investigation and keeping tabs on places too. It's like if
Yeah.
you're going past the boat ramp and you see, you know, four trucks at the boat ramp with their muddy sticker on the back window, it's like, okay, like they're probably in there deer hunting. But
Uh-huh.
if they got all their duck commander stuff on the other hand, well, then you can maybe think, well, maybe they're just duck hunting in there.
I guess on the habitat side of things during turkey season, looking for areas that they've burned recently too.
Hmm.
Like finding those places while driving around can be another thing that sticks out for something to look for during turkey season specifically.
Hmm. I think that goes though for all hunting seasons. Like, habitat is really a main part of this whole topic. This
Mm-hmm.
is, I guess, now our transition into the habitat. The pull offs and stuff will kind of come along as you're getting more experience doing this, but also um, inevitably you're going to be passing those places. So just pull in there, take a look at it, and move on. But really, a lot of times what we're doing is going to check areas that we think may be good, either close to the road or further back in there. And a lot of times I would say we're actually looking at the places that may be further back in there, and along the way we might pick up on something that we can't tell from the map, like a burn, like
Mm-hmm.
uh, a cut of some sort that you can't tell even happened from the map, maybe because of the aerial imagery, or it was recent enough that it's not on that, you know, it's not updated, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's a big, big part of all this. And I really like to just slow roll and really pay attention to timber types, because, for example, if there could have no sign of hunter pressure. There could be, very few pull offs, but if the habitat's all just, monotonous and the same, and what you can tell from the road, it's like, well, maybe this isn't of interest to me. But on the other hand, a lot of times when we find, again, overlooked spots, there's something about the habitat that we kind of lock on to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In addition to like timber types too, like what type of egg is planted in this field this time of year? Is the corn harvested at this time of year? And then taking note of that, and then in the future, like this spot was good when there was beans planted here. I have if there's beans planted here again, it might be something to focus on again this year. But finding what's been planted in fields on the public or even adjacent private too is another, like from habitat standpoint, something that I'm taking note of, and one of the main reasons I'm driving around, because you can tell that there's egg fields from a map, but you don't know what's planted there in that year. So that's one other thing from a habitat standpoint.
That's actually, yeah, a really good point. It's something that we definitely do a lot of, especially where,
Mm.
there's a lot of broken habitat in ag country. It's very beneficial to do that.
Yeah.
Um, I've noticed major changes too in areas from a bean year to a corn year. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's, better to have the beans, and other times it's better to have the corn. It just depends on how that spot sets up. But again, driving around these areas, you can really quickly figure out, if this spot sets up better for it to be, one or the other, and then you can just make your decisions based off that.
Yeah. Or there's a sea of corn somewhere, and didn't seem like there was a lot going on as far as deer movement within the woods. But then once that corn's harvested and they're not bedding in that corn anymore and they all dump into the woods, like taking note of the change once they take big blocks of corn out too is another thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think any of the things that we're talking about are necessarily things that it's a one and done deal.
Yeah, it's
Like,
all situational for sure.
yeah, like I like to do this in places that I've been to tons of times because from one year to the next, when you're talking about public land, all of these factors may change, you know. There's always the potential that, you know, a whole block gets timber cut or one year it doesn't get planted and it's now, you know, tall grass and it becomes, you know, a brushy old field versus a bean field or a wheat field, and every single season those things vary a lot.
Hmm.
The other thing that I like to look at from the road is, can you glass? Like, are there places that you can get on a high knob and just do your glassing and be able to move from spot to spot pretty quickly without investing boots on the ground time? It doesn't set up great for that in every situation. Like, if you're listening to this and you're living in the eastern United States with solid timber, there's a lot of situations where it's going to be hard to glass. But don't ever write off the fact that you may see something from the road. I feel like that's something that is a common theme or a common statement that I hear hunters say is, well, you know, it's just too thick here to glass from the road. There's been a lot of situations where I've been driving down the road in solid timber and looked up and seen a deer or a turkey. That just immediately puts you in the game. So I think taking advantage of little windows of visibility that you have within an otherwise thick area is still important.
Yeah, or might get lucky and have something cross the road right in front of you, and that's
Hey,
like
buddy.
Turkey in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's the one of the best examples. We're driving down, and I mean we're deep in the forest. Like there's no openings around us for a long way, and sun just runs right across the road in front of us, and like now we're in the game so much that we got him the next morning.
Yeah.
And I just think that there's always value in keeping your eyes peeled. Take your time, stay in your lane, and just have your head on a swivel and be, you know, aware of what's going on. If you see a little pull off and you can look down through the timber, pull in there and glass. I mean, even if there's timber, there's still plenty of opportunity for you to see something. And I just think that no matter what the species that we're hunting, the more I'm surprised by the opportunities that we have right off the road just because somebody was paying attention, you know? One time we were hunting elk and Colin just looked over, he's like, there's a bull right there. We look at the map and it's like, well, he's going right into public, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think I was turkey hunting with my girlfriend Allie this week, and I think she's probably got sick of the number of times I said, "Keep your eyes peeled. Make sure you got your eyes peeled," and she's always responded, "Oh, they're peeled." So I've ingrained that into her that always have your eyes peeled when you're cruising around, no matter what.
you definitely should.
Hmm.
Another thing that I like to look for is edge. If you're dealing with a solid timber area, there's a lot of edge that you just can't see from a map. I mean, depending on what that aerial photo looks like, if it's a summertime photo, there might be timber thinning or something that has a really distinct edge, or maybe there's something that isn't updated on that map. And I think that looking for edge a lot of times will ultimately then lead you to deer sign, which will kind of be our next topic. But I really like to look for that edge, and there's just so many examples. Like we could be talking about mountain laurel, we could be talking about rhododendron, we could be talking about, you know, a clear cut that isn't updated on the map.
Age structure of pines, like are they mature pines? Are they really thick, short cedars? That's more bedding habitat. Just trying to put that story together of what's bedding habitat, what's not bedding habitat, where's an edge that is an easy travel route for something coming out of certain bedding habitats. Yeah.
One thing that I didn't suspect to be as much of a factor in my road scouting as it is now is creek bottoms in a big timber setting. There have been quite a few situations where you find some true diversity in that creek bottom, and a lot of times you can see that from the road. So, for example, if I'm going through public land that's broken and I see a creek bottom on my map that I'm about to cross on the road, there's two things that I'll look at even if I'm not on public. One is how deep is that water? Because, like we've mentioned many times, you may be able to, um, put waders on and get across something that most people aren't crossing. Use some sort of water access if you can reach it from a public access. But also, what type of vegetation is grown through that? So, let's say it's all timber, and I can see that from this road that I'm on, if I can tell there's a lot of thick cover in that creek bottom and it runs up into public, well, that might be something I walk in and check. And that's
Mhm.
really helped get on some specific areas. There's an area that I hunted with Keith a few years ago, and we actually made a setup in the bottom, right along a creek bottom, middle of the day, super hot. And the whole reason that we set up down there was because it was pretty thick. Ultimately saw a buck. He came to like, I don't really want to get into the details. It's pretty depressing, but he came to like 4 yards and he just walked right where I didn't think there was a trail, which was a total mistake, but he was a big one. And, that particular spot, you can tell is that thick from way away where the road is. I mean, to public, walk the public in, it's a good ways back in there. But from the road, even though there's private on both sides, just sitting in your vehicle, you can see that it's thick and it runs up into that public. And I just think that's really been helpful.
If it's a muddy bank, like just trying to see if there's what the density of wildlife is in that habitat. You can tell from water crossings a lot with tracks.
A river is an area that you can see a good ways down.
Mhm.
There's situations where I've sat and just glassed, down a river bottom right in the channel because you may see something cross there. Or a lot of times deer will bed right along it. Turkeys will, be roosted right there along a water source like that. So just keeping that in mind as well.
One other thing from a habitat standpoint, especially like once the leaves are starting to fall off the trees, like the leaves will hold on to oaks a lot longer than other trees, especially in like in a mixed hardwood scenario. So trying to use that time to identify where oak flats are within mixed hardwoods. That's another thing that I'll look for in that time of year specifically.
Hmm. That is a good point. I remember talking about that with Warb when we were in Pennsylvania back in 2020. We were
Mm-hmm.
looking at a hillside and I was like, man, it's so easy to pick out those oak stands just
Yep.
because you can simply see that color change in the canopy. So
Yep.
that's absolutely something you can tell from the road. And sometimes that might just lead you to a specific spot where maybe deer feeding or,
Yep.
bedding and feeding. So that's a good point. I guess before we move to deer sign, I'd like to talk about a specific example of picking a spot off the road just based off habitat. So we had been cruising past this spot every day, just like everybody else had apparently been doing, going into the middle of this piece of public land and going into the areas where, we had more room to roam. But there was this little sliver of public that we were going past every day, and all of a sudden it kind of dawned on somebody. I don't even really remember who brought it up first, but it's like that little spot right there looks pretty good just from here. You could tell that there was a lot more diversity in there than there were in a lot of the other places that we were hunting. Or maybe we were finding areas similar, but when we found those other spots, they were just deeper into the public, and we were seeing deer come out of them. So it was like we're seeing deer come out of a place like that way back in there, and we've never seen anybody pulled off right here. Yeah, every morning and evening we drive in and out of here and there's nobody there. So we decided to do a wind bump in that area. And really, we would have never otherwise done it had we not just noticed the diversity. But you could tell how many layers there were in there too. There was like cottonwoods in the center, and then from the outside into those cottonwoods, you can just tell there's a lot of edge and transition line in there. So I was the driver, and Brody and Jake were set up on the downwind side of the thicket, and I just got upwind of it and kind of zigzagged my way on the edge of this thicket. Eventually, I got to kind of the far side of the thicket from where those guys were set up, and I bumped a buck. There was tons of beds right on this one particular transition line, and there was rubs in it, there was beds, and it was like a no-brainer that bucks had been spending time in this spot quite a bit. We decided that we were going to come back, but we were going to give it a little bit of a break. Ended up giving it a break for believe 2 days, 3 days after the bump, we ended up shooting what I believe is the same buck coming back in there to bed. We heard him moving around right at very first light. He plopped down in the middle of it, and then as soon as the winds picked up that morning, he made a shift, came to point blank, and we got a shot at him. And that was like one of the most memorable habitat spotted from the road situations. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. I mean, the layers of habitat, but also driving past and just keeping tabs on it. And I think we were subconsciously keeping tabs on it too, right? It wasn't like we were saying, oh, this spot, like we better keep an eye on it. It's just
Yeah.
like all of a sudden, like, man, we've been here for like 4 days and there's never been anybody here, but we've seen people in all these other places. Maybe we should just check this spot right off the road. Ended up shooting that buck in a tree stand 200 yards from the road. I ranged the road as 200 yards. And since then, that's happened quite a few times between, the whole group. It's like pretty surprising how often that happens. But next, deer sign. There's certain things that I really like looking for. Number one is deer trails or deer tracks crossing the road. It sounds so silly, but in a place where there's a dirt road or something, I mean, a lot of times you can just straight up judge the size of a track on the road,
Yeah.
which is really helpful. But even if you're dealing with paved roads, a lot of times you can see coming down the edge, you can see a trail, or sometimes you can see rubs, even just getting visual on deer coming out of areas like that at last light too.
Yeah, I think like one example from the tracks on the road standpoint, I think of that hunt in Ohio this last muzzleloader drive season.
Mm-hmm.
When we were walking that road and we found that huge track. Kind of told us that we should do a drive in there, and I don't remember if we did or not. I think we did, and we didn't turn anything up, but it was a giveaway that there was a mature buck somewhere in that area. And
Well,
then,
we saw one. We saw one right after you guys found that track. Even though it was headed the other way, we did
yeah,
see a
yeah,
big buck right that
uh-huh,
that very hunt. So
yeah,
it's like can give you confidence and it can give you confirmation that you're in the right area.
yeah. And turkey season, it's really helpful just finding turkey tracks, especially if it is a dirt road where you can do that. And like I mentioned before, like after rains, like really looking hard for tracks because not only is the ground softer where it's more likely to create a track, but also it's pretty recent if it's made where when it rained last, that track had to be made within that time frame since it last rained.
Hmm.
That's especially after rain, just looking real hard for tracks on the road.
Snow as well. That's
Sure.
one thing that I feel like we haven't really factored into any of this conversation is how much snow can benefit you in a lot of ways when driving around. Whether that's like straight up getting the visual or just showing you where there's fresh tracks or consistent deer movements. So, a couple of places that come to mind that I really utilized the tactic of like hanging my head out the window looking for tracks was Alabama and Minnesota. And I know those are like very different, so that's why I bring both of them up. When hunting in Minnesota, a lot of times we would get to an edge and we would just look right down that edge and try to see if there was deer tracks coming across there. Or if there was public land that we thought deer might be bedded on and maybe like a food source over here, we would check those tracks. And that's ultimately what led us into the area where a really big buck was living. You know the story of the one coming in 6 minutes
Mhm.
before legal light.
Yeah.
That's how we found out he was in the area and it was worth hunting. I mean, we scouted in that area and found buck sign, but there was also big buck tracks going back into that bedding area. So that was super helpful. But then in Alabama, it was a very different situation where we had gravel road. We could look to see where tracks were, and we started finding that these deer really weren't living that far from the road. And I think you kind of brought up the point earlier of deer monitoring hunter pressure. And
Mhm.
I think that is something that really helped us have more confidence in some of the places that we ended up hunting when we were down there. we would drive down the road and we would see high densities of tracks. And actually, in one case, we found where two bucks just straight up fought in the road. It was super cool. There was all these scuffed up tracks and they were big, and you could tell they were just facing each other. It was so obvious that it was a buck fight, and that was right on the road, like on the gravel road.
Mm-hmm.
And what light bulb it kind of created was, okay, if these things lay right here, they certainly hear us pull down the road, and then they definitely hear us pull right into these obvious pull offs. So what we started doing in that situation was we'd go up to a mile sometimes further than where we wanted to hunt, park at a different access point where he couldn't hear us if he was there, and then we'd sneak down the road and just pop right off the road and hunt. And that was really, really beneficial. So like super thick areas, I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, if you find a scenario like that too, it almost makes them more vulnerable because they're relying on that monitoring of that lot as one of their safety mechanisms. So if you do something different when it comes to accessing where you think they're betting to monitor that, it almost gives you the leg up on that because they're
Mm-hmm.
using that to keep safe.
Mm-hmm. Keep safe. I have another example of like a weird one that just happened to me recently. I was scouting. This is a lot of these things coming together. So I was driving down the road and I had private land on both sides, but butting up to that private land was some public. And I noticed on the private side it was really thick. There was a lot of tall grass. There was like a house that didn't strike me as hunt camp. It just kind of was a rundown, beat down house. There might have not even been anybody living there. I don't really remember. But I was looking at OnX, and the same landowner owned both sides of the road, and it just didn't appear to me that there was any hunting access going on there. So I was like, well, there's probably not people coming in from the private. So that was a good sign. Then I turned and I went up the road, and now eventually run into the public land, and that's on both sides. And from the road, I could tell that it was steep uphill and it was really thick. And again, on my map, I couldn't really see that.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, man, I can see on my map now that there's a transition line right up on top of that ridge. And that ridge runs right into that private where it's also thick. I was like, that just seems like something that deer could be traveling. I'm going down the road, and I also notice, hey, there's no pull off on either side of the road. Again, it's super steep and thick, so nobody's pulling off right here. I drove probably a mile up the road, and there finally was an obvious pull off. But from that pull off, the trail went up one way, and where I'm looking at is across the road the other way.
Mm-hmm.
So I parked there, walked down there, and I'm again right off the road. I mean, I'm a few hundred yards above the road, and I get up on that transition line, and it's immediately like rub, 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 scrape, scrape, scrape. I'm like, yeah, this is looking pretty good. And I was like, I better go walk down there and just kind of see what that edge looks like. Sure enough, I get down there, it gets even thicker. And I'm walking through there filming stuff with my phone. Sure enough, I get right to the end, right where it starts to kind of drop. And there's a bunch of big beds, and I find a big 5-point side. I'm like, had I not been paying attention to all those little details along the way, I would have never went up in there. And honestly, in hunting season, I don't know that I'd have had the confidence to take the time out of my day to go in there and do it. So in this particular situation, the fact that it was off season certainly helped my odds. And the fact that I had a hurt knee and couldn't get around real well.
Uh-huh. They probably shouldn't have been doing that anyway with your knee. Just
That
walking
was,
around with sore ACL.
yeah, that was with a completely obliterated ACL. Sometimes that just plays out that way. I don't know that I would have ever found that spot or even given it a half a thought had I not just driven past and just noticed, that private line being pretty thick right there. So
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
think that's cool.
for sure. I guess one other thing I just wanted to bring up was that looking at the public areas for sure, but also just observing surrounding private areas just to see like those trails crossing the road or like from a deer sign perspective, like trying to find deer sign on private around it just to try to get a better understanding of the deer density in those areas. Like, okay, the private land around this has a ton of deer sign. There's probably a good deer density on the public that's right by here too. But not just limiting that drive around scouting to the public areas, but also checking out private areas just to get a better grasp of deer density.
Yeah. Maybe they're not living there all the time, but let's say you're in a high deer density area and on the private that butts up to public, if you got a bunch of really thick habitat where big bucks feel safe and they're undisturbed, if there's doe groups that are living on the public, at some point in the season, those bucks are going to start checking that, paying attention to feeders and stuff that are bordering public land.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked with Land Smathers about this exact thing where if you look on X, a lot of times on an opening, you're looking at that aerial image, you can just see the tripod shadow laying down on the ground. It's like, well, when that photo is taken, at least there's a feeder sitting right in the middle of that field, and deer may be coming from that public thicket down to private. So I just think if that's legal in your state, it's worth taking note of as well.
Yeah. Or identifying, like some guy has a bunch of skulls on the outside of his property that is right next to public, and just seeing, okay, there are pretty big deer here. Like, that's a pretty good giveaway.
I have a pin on my map that says Big Shed Guy, because on his little hunting cabin or whatever, he's just got big sheds all across the front porch, and it's like, okay, well, thanks for the tip, dude.
Yeah. Most of what we talked about is like current during season. I think during off season, I have a lot different mindset. Like specifically when it comes to deer, I like to drive around a lot in the off season, especially in the winter when food sources are limited or habitat's limited. It seems like deer tend to group up in places that have great habitat at that time of year, and they're just way more visible at that time of year. So you can get a really good grasp on like where there's high deer densities in the late winter months. And I like to drive around a lot during that time frame. Plus there's a lot of snow on the ground, so you can tell, like, even if there isn't deer out in the field, you can tell it's just littered with tracks or torn up from deer digging for food. Like trying to utilize that off season time after the season to find where there's high deer densities is one thing I like to do a lot.
It gets way easier to see those transition lines. Like that is again the reason that I found that spot that I just talked about that was close to the road, where I could just see a transition line going up through that led onto the public. And it's like those are the types of things that you can really get a good visual on when there's no leaves on the trees. And early in the season, like September, October, a lot of places you're not going to be able to see that nearly as well.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap this one up. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. And if there's anything that you want to hear us talk about in the future when it comes to scouting from the road or finding overlooked spots, let us know, or topics in general. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.